Hello and most welcome to 895 of the Heidegger series. We will today talk about how scales varies. Usually when you read about quantum mechanics or anything similar to that, you usually talk about scale invariance. And that scale invariance is not an invariance. No, there's no scale possible, but there is no scale according to a general universal scaling thing. There is no measuring rod out in the universe, neither when it comes to time, neither when it comes to length, and oddly enough there is no measuring rod when it comes to knowledge. All those things are very important to understand, and I think especially the philosopher Paul Feyerabend is one of those who really pointed out the impossibility of having a measuring rod for knowledge, and especially in his first 3 books he is attacking the idea that the whole world could be known as a thing, that we can sort of investigate the world, mapping the world, I think he calls it, and that project being paradoxical already at the start. So really from the beginning it doesn't serve a proper purpose. What we do have instead is a scaling that goes both ways. Both the subject and the object are scale independent as such, but together in the meeting point of fractality there is actually a scaling going on, and all of a sudden scale becomes immensely important. It is no longer anything to be discarded, which it in a way actually is in classical physics. Having an absolute measuring point is a giving up of the scaling completely. It is a sort of a prosthetic to real scaling. Real scaling can only happen when a subject meets an object. And in that very process, we have a directed, careful adjustment between the two scaling. That is of incredible importance. We can, in a way, compare scaling to intention. When scaling is active and we decide on what level of the iterations, think about the fern, I think that could help. On what scale in the horizon meets the horizon the subject is, versus on what scale the object is. And it is in this very connection where the object meets the subject where scale becomes important. This is usually referred to as focal setting, and it points to the incredible importance that you have sort of an access to a varied focal setting. It is not fixated once and forever. This is here also where scale actually enters into the business. A way of easing this up to get closer to the understanding is by thinking about intention as being something outside the subject. I had a very old relative, and he's most usually referred to things outside of himself as being of tradition, and himself being more or less objective. That is how the twist that later came to be only refer to the subject being the only thing subject, or the ego, or the I, whereas earlier on the object side had traditional features, cultural features, not designed or designated by a subject or a group of subject or tradition of subject and so forth. But that in its stead, that tradition is coming from the object. And he saw the chalice of the church and the holy water and the ostia as being of Christianity, but not coming from himself or anyone else. And I think we have a very hard time to understand that, but I think a little by little we can ease into that thinking, a reversal of the object and subject standing. And this reversal, I would say, is more or less necessary to come into this more flexible readout that is not as fixated, not as stern, not malleable, as of not being possible to adjust, making more lenient, softening up, changing, directing, and I would say the last one, being in control of. And I think beneath this there could be some either sterner presupposition that are harder to get out of place, but I think it's a good way to start here. This should be done layer by layer. It can't be done in one go, I would say. The focal setting has two steps. First, understanding that there is a focal setting already in place and that we constantly use it. And by understanding that, we will also understand it can be changed. Before we understand that there is a focal setting, we cannot change it. And I'm pretty sure once we understand that there is a focal setting, we can begin to change it. The second thing is train the setting of the focal setting. We are not used to being active towards the world. I think our whole life has been directed towards passivity. That is thinking everything that turns up is just coming to me. I don't do anything. I'm not a participating agent in my own life. It just happens to me. There is no direct effect coming from me. And that way of thinking, I would say, is the default mode of Western society. So you can be pretty sure you have that default mode. Everyone has it. It is inescapable. As I mentioned before, I think the conditioning for this, the priming of the idea of passivity, is something that happens already before we get verbal, before language has been acquired in us, or language has been acquired but to a very low degree. But once we do these two things, first get to an understanding that the fractality leads to that there is a focal setting. There is always a distance, so to speak, between the two differences. The differences I send out, for instance, the signal of the ear, to the outside. Me being as much different that I can possibly be will make it possible to send out as an acute, complicated, stern, decisive difference from the other side. When these two meet, we get a read-off. We see the difference. And this is this difference that had been reduced to objects, reality, properties in the lower level of a chaotic system. We can learn how to defix the screws that regulates this, can make it much less locked, not as rusted. I say it's even rusted. It's rusted in that way you can't even see the knob of the screw. The bolt cannot be visible because the knob of the bolt has rusted off completely. Talib Nassim has a very good example from his book Anti-Fragility, and he took an example from the currency market where newcomers, new disciples in the business, the new ones learning the business, the trainees and so forth, often are very, very successful, and that has been a mystery for a very long time until people realized that they read off the whole fractality on a quite different scale. They don't go into all the rules. And in the regular take, in the lower level of chaotic system, the ordinary metaphysics of presence or logocentrism, that would mean that they don't have enough information to do anything. But because of scaling, that is not the case. It can actually, on the contrary, mean that they have great access to the whole thing because their adjusting system is not severed by the idea of the logocentric facts of different rules. Maybe 100, 200 rules, as Talib mentioned in his book. So, and it's not about simplification. Still, if there is a fractality going off and you scale read, as I call it, you learn how to do the focal setting in a correct way. That is still very complicated. It doesn't feel complicated because you are probably used as a trainee to do it. You are already skilled when you come into the business. Trust me, I would not be able to do that same very thing. But what you need to remember is that the iteration in the scale invariance of a fractal object means there is always a scale independence in the sense of Newtonian mechanics going on in every part of space, because all space is fractal. It's not fractality built into a three-dimensional feature. Everything is fractal. And if you don't believe it, you have to think all the lines delineating the coordinate system of Cartesian calculus, they are still fractal. It's our perception that is not complex enough for us to see that they are actually fractal. I think one of the great hints there is, when am I not that fractal? I think it's a level. Well, you're definitely not fractal if you don't take in the surroundings. If you, like I just did now, forget the surroundings and go into yourself, over-focus, over-concentrate and overthink, ruminate upon what I'm supposed to say, on how what I said before did sound and so forth, I will not be able to access the greater complexity of what is actually out there. So that means a rather big simplification of the complexities that could be reached once I make myself more open to a greater complexity. That is very important to remember. You can always reach the greater complexities if you yourself first understand the working of the focal setting, that you get more flexible in thinking and in posture. You do always have to take in the surroundings. This cannot happen only in the head, whatever that means. It is, I'm thinking of this photo that was an illustration in one of the early books of Frederick Matthias Alexander. Somebody really thinking very hard like this, forgetting his or her own body. A Rodin statue, the thinker, is also a good example. Well, what happens if you put yourself into that position? You cannot enter into fractality. This is a blocking off of fractality, not opening up to two horizons, possibly being able to read off each other, going into each other, having a transference in between each other. It's one of those things that are immensely important to remember, and that is, there is not only fractality out there, you yourself is fractal, and your ignorance of that fractality means that your chaotic system is on a lower level, but that can be helped. And one of the very, very easiest help is to create a strange attractor. Strange attractor is a constant iteration of a verbal phrase, and I'd say that verbal phrase has to be at least one regular verso and recto of the paper, or half of the recto of the paper. That at least is the minimum complexity that will help to sort of fixate a sort of strange attractor to build your chaotic system. The second thing you need to do is to open up for disturbances to enter. This will make your system stronger. That will make your capability to focus strongly on one single thing. For instance, the verses, I would say one recto and half a verso at least. You'll be able more to focus on that, and at the very same time you will also take in more of the surroundings, and you end up more or less balanced in a very nice position. And this position actually makes it possible for you to enter into the details of the complexities at the very same time, which is in itself incredibly interesting. Another hint, so you can understand this better, is to talk about a functioning scale and an absolute scale. An absolute scale is when you have given up the mission to be lenient, flexible in your scaling from the subjective side, and therefore you don't gain access to the objective side. You give the two things up, and you say that there is an absolute scale. This is throwing in the towel preemptively and not caring about anything else. And that leads directly to passivity and the idea, your personal subjective idea, that the world comes from the outside. That idea can't even be shared by other ones that share your passivity. Might be that you speak in a similar manner, but going deeper into the fractality, you will notice you don't even speak about the same things. I would say that you don't even know what you're talking about. This is my own experience, how I felt it to be when you go from the idea of the middle idea of having fractality within 3 dimensions. Once I started to understand that the fractality is everywhere, also in the surrounding space where I put in the fractality, my next understanding is I did not understand what I meant earlier. when I said to myself I'm doing practicality within the 3 dimensions. Rather complex way to see the whole thing. Fractality is a large-scale deconstruction of classical physics that takes the subject the learner will develop in a path, and he will find out more and more to greater extent that he is not directly cut off from reality, that reality still enters into his system. And he will also notice that he can actively project his own thinking, his own sort of presence in the world. And this furthering of the presencing in the world makes that you can actually go into the other horizon and you can be in reality. And that's quite a massive gain. Another interesting thing is when we don't have much possibility of changing the focal setting, we will also have less fractal read-off, and we will not be able to access a knowing that lies beyond and that can inform our lives and doing to the same high level. That means that our decisions, our projection, our retention will not be as effective and will not yield a good result, and that will be once more a sort of a pointing and indication. Please do be more passive. You don't have to put so much effort. Slouch in the couch, fall together, shut yourself off from the world, because falling together, collapsing in the sofa, the bed, means that you intentionally give up life and the world. And you say to yourself, this is reality, there's no need to put any direction to anything. But the reason is you had this experience since you were little. It is a pre-verbal experience, something that Heidegger showed very clearly. Clark, Clark showed that very clearly when you can understand that the establishment of in, into, and out of, it's already in the pre-verbal state. This is when we learn the very first expressions that we later will use. But in the end, once you understand these things and you get into constructing your own fractality, you will also begin to create a momentum. This is the acquiring of the key. You cannot know what the key, the prana or the chi is before you start this journey, because it's not an energy, it is directedness, which is something completely different. Energy is, as I mentioned before, not a very well chosen word. It came already in the late 19th century from the Theosophical Society, and I think one of the reasons they chose energy is that they didn't know what it was. They really wanted to put it into ordinary Western language, and they used one of these very common pun word, that was energy, coming from physics. And since New Age in the late 19th century, especially in the shape of Theosophy, took a lot of their ideas from physics. This is where we have this with dimensions, energy, and so forth. These words are already established in our language as not having much of meaning. But trust me, prana, ki, and chi does mean something. And once you realize that, once you start having a focal setting, you will also understand that you can change the focal setting. And there is no need to talk about prana before you understand the change of focal setting. You are in such a low level of energy, so there won't come any prana to you. and therefore you shouldn't or couldn't or can't know what prana is. This is my own experience. There is also another take, and this comes from knowledge. Knowledge starts to seep in here more and more. But the very idea that you understand the universe or have a sort of understanding how things works, and that you constantly ask yourself or others the why question, the what question in different modes, that will in itself block out both the understanding of that the focus setting is changeable. It will also block off further learning. This is a preemptive take on knowledge. It's a way of trying to capture knowledge in a way that knowledge won't give into. If you have the whole world, and if you understand most things, you are most probably dead wrong. It is too early to understand anything. Think of knowledge as something incredibly vast, that's the word, and that you are looking into. You're a little bit like Livingstone. You are visiting the continent Africa for the first time, and you know that every inch, every yard you step on will be unknown. Walk into knowledge with that attitude, not the attitude I already know these things, or I can have a clear opinion, or even I can ask a lot of questions about this because my conception of the whole thing is so clear, so I'm ready to ask a lot of questions. No, be very careful there. Preemptive ideas of having knowledge is the hinder number one when it comes to knowledge. The hinder number one when it comes to space is obviously the fixation of the focal setting, and the hindrance number one when it comes to not getting anywhere with temporal fractality is the idea that time is outside yourself, or that there are two times, objective time and subjective time. I would say those are the two most common hindrances when it comes to these three categories. Well, at least from my perspective, it was how it most. But do remember a very, very good trope for understanding this. Think of yourself being on a very low level of knowledge. And of course, if your knowledge is very low down here, and if you sort of zoom in on the whole world and say, I want to try to understand the whole world or the political situation in Uganda or anything like that, you are on a low level. That means that you will already have preemptive idea of what it is to be a Ugandan politician or something like that, and that will be a blockage. And that way of blocking out things are rather similar to what happens in time and space. But I would say in this very case it's easier to understand in the terms of knowledge, how knowledge gets blocked out because you have a preemptive idea how it works. And this is very similar to this funny lady in the United States who writes traveling books without visiting the countries, or for that sake even reading about the countries. They are made as humoresque books. They are not meant to guide anyone, but if you for some reason would have taken them seriously, they would block out knowledge. But in this case, the very idea, and that's the thing that Paul Feyerabend often pointed out, that you say you have the world in your hand or the world can be understandable, sounds very positive, but it's actually one of the worst things you can do, at least if you are at the lower level, which is the default level from metaphysics of presence. Metaphysics of presence is in itself a lower level on reality. It is less fractality. And since the complexities of the world are in the end fractal, your fractality will block out those fractals. You don't have a lot of complexities, therefore you don't have any great amount of knowledge either. So there is so to speak codependent blocking out or codependent lowering of the readout. Your fractality when it comes in is of low value. What reaches you is also going to be of low value. And of course this flies into the face of the standard model. The standard model says that we have constantly the same amount of knowledge accessible for us. We don't have to do anything for us to gain that knowledge. We can slouch, we don't have to take in the surroundings. Our body are not dependent on our understanding procedures, or the body doesn't affect our understanding procedures. I might be half sleeping or occupied with doing other things. Understanding will still come because understanding is cheap. Well, that sort of understanding is dead cheap. Why is that? It is not very complex, it's not very fractal, it doesn't give you any guidance in predicting the future, or it will not inform your decision. It won't enrich in your life. It's a little bit like comparing wondrous Renaissance paintings to comic paintings, something like that. They don't have the same value for you. Or why not pop music compared to classical advanced music coming from why not Marais or Rameau, Jean-Philippe Rameau, some of those people that make complex melodies that goes at least on 8 levels, up to 20 levels sometime. The great majority of people today can't hear more than 2, tops 3. That means that your hearing is not advanced enough to hear it. And this is why I'm talking about different levels. That stratified worldview comes directly from the very fact that we are subjects, living in an objective world. And that also means that our fractality is caused by intention. That intention is somewhat similar to the intention you find out in the universe. The intention that keeps the galaxies together, our solar system, each and individual thing in the universe are kept together by the chaotic system's perseverance and permanence. I think this is a very good point to stop. I say thank you very much, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now. Here we have one of the 3 bifurcations in Sweden. It means that this water do not flow anywhere. It cuts the island of Hisingen into 2, but there is no flow. I don't know if that's visible. Therefore, of course, we cannot have a vortex or a maelstrom. And therefore also there is, at least summertime, some stench coming out of the water. But still, this early in the season, it's not that bad. But I wouldn't swim in it. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.